The satellite's not going to do anybody any good if it can't get the data that it's collecting back to the ground, or if it can't obey commands that are sent back up.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Aerospace Corporation's Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy. So today we're here to talk about war in space. What does it look like? What doesn't it look like? And then how can we protect not just our own interests and those of our allies in space, but also protect the entire environment for all users? So I'm really excited to say we've got two Aerospace Corporation experts. We've got Britany Washburn and Kristen Kolarik. So thank you, ladies, for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So I'm going to ask you, I'll go ahead and start with you, Kristen. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself briefly. Basically, what do you do? Where do you do it? And how long have you been doing it for?
Thank you, Colleen. My name is Kristen Kolarik. I obviously work for aerospace. I've been with aerospace for 23 years. Prior to that, worked in the commercial sector and was in the Air Force. Right now, I support Space Operations Command in their Combat Power Directorate. And so the basics of that are shepherding a lot of the new weapon systems and space domain awareness sensing systems as they go through acquisition, fielding, and then eventually into operations.
Great, thank you. I didn't realize you had been with aerospace for 23 years. Wow, what a great experience. Britany?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Britany Washburn. I manage our System of Systems modeling section within the Mission Analysis and Operations Department. So it's a brand new section. I just started taking over in April, so only about 2 months, but we're really focused on modeling multi-domain systems. So today we'll be talking a bit about space, but also how space impacts our other domains. And that's the bread and butter of what my section does. We do quite a bit of wargaming. So we model different agents inside what looks like truly like a game. So we give them behaviors and they can move around, and we really watch them to see what sort of behaviors we can tease out to help us understand better ways to execute our multi-domain systems. So I've been doing this, like I said, for only about 2 months, but prior to that, I've been with aerospace for just under 5 years. I've spent some time in our program offices, and now I'm back in our engineering and technology group, doing lots of coding and programming and focusing on the warfighter.
Great, thank you. And Britany, you've already kind of touched a little bit on the multi-domain aspect. That's going to be really important to what we talk about today in terms of the space domain. But before we get to that, I'm going to start with the big question: is space contested? The bottom line up front. So, Kristen, what do you think? Is space contested environment?
Absolutely. Space is absolutely contested. There's a couple of different ways to look at contested. When you talk to any military officer and they get back into doctrine, we know that there's a continuum. And so even when there's not active fighting, there is still competition. And then as competition progresses, you're going to get into heated competition or just on the verge of contested. For those of us who are lucky enough to work with the intelligence community, we know that not only is space getting far more congested, far more players, but the nation states in general, and the US, our allies, Russia, China, India, have all been not only putting up space capabilities, but the means to protect those. And so that's against cyber threats, that's against electromagnetic warfare. And as the threat grows over time, we're going to see more and more kinetic options as well.
Okay, we're gonna jump into those ways that space can be what we need to protect against. But first, Britany, what about how space is seen either as a kind of key enabler for other domains or how it's seen as its own domain? What are your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. When I think about contested space, the other part that I focus on, I'm involved with a bit of operations support, is how it's limited resources. So what are we actually fighting over, right? And so there's a limited amount of specific resources that enable space. So we have to really play by certain rules, and not everyone likes to play by those rules. And that's where we get into trouble. So a couple I'll just, hit on is one of the biggest things is communication. And so we work within a continuum also of just purely radio frequency bands. We can't talk to our satellites, we can't do anything. And so everyone has specific slots of those bands, and they're starting to fill up. And so that's another point of contention, I guess, is that once those bands are gone, we're going to have to do either lotteries or figure out some sort of way to actually let folks talk to their satellites without talking over each other. And then in terms of physical space, we could talk about this more, but there's literally limited space on certain orbits, and some are more desirable than others. So we have to really talk through that, and not everyone likes to work together, I guess we could say.
So that almost goes to what you were saying, Kristen, in terms of maybe how satellites could be attacked or what exactly we need to defend against.
So we typically will break a space system up into 3 segments. There's the on-orbit segment, the satellite itself. There's a link segment that connects the satellite to the ground, because otherwise you wouldn't have it up there to begin with. And then there's a ground segment. The space segment is actually one of the hardest to attack, simply because it's so far away. But there are, on the kinetic side, direct ascent anti-satellite weapons. And we have seen recent tests from China and Russia on that type of weapon. We also, on the electromagnetic spectrum side of things, have seen weapons that go after the usage of the satellite's EM spectrum. So whether if they're a communication satellite, it might be going after a Ka or a Ku band as a jammer. If you're visible light, you will see dazzling. Think about, there's warning labels on all laser pointers, don't shine them in your eyes. That's exactly what we're doing.
Oh, interesting. So the satellite sensors are dazzled so that they're temporarily blinded.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
The link segment, as we move out of the satellite itself and into the connection, it can be jammed or overcome, just simple overpowering. Think about sitting in a room, you're listening to the radio, your kid comes in, they've got their radio turned up, you can't hear yours anymore because they're just too loud. So there are different ways to go after the link segment. And then the last piece is the ground segment. The satellite's not going to do anybody any good if it can't get the data that it's collecting back to the ground, or if it can't obey commands that are sent back up. And so any part of the ground segment that's vulnerable, and that could be to a straight out kinetic attack, thinking bombs falling, or something as simple as the communication line that connects the wherever the ground operations center is to the antenna that has to link to the satellite. If that fiber is cut, if a backhoe runs over it, anything that disconnects the ground segment from the link and the link to the satellite is a way, as an attack vector, is a way of going after that space system so that it cannot do its mission. And I'm sure I missed something, Britany. What did I miss?
I think you covered that really well. Only aspect that we often consider is even the human element and latencies. So even if you just delay the person who controls that satellite or any attack on any of that team, I always come back to teams and the people. Our ultimate point, right, is, like you said, getting the information where it needs to go. And so even if you can't get that out to the end user, that's a problem as well. The biggest thing is GPS. We always come back to GPS. If you can't get those coordinates to maybe the warfighter on the field, you failed. It doesn't matter that the satellite collected that information. It didn't get where it needed to go.
Yeah, which of course, that makes it sound like communications is the lifeline to all of it anyway, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And Britany, you also mentioned something about, in the multi-domain kind of world that, an attack on one domain affects others. So just talk that out for a minute.
Sure. It gets more and more complicated when you start adding domains. Kristen talked about ground and space. Ground can be static. It could also be moving. So we have troops that move, and you always have to be able to get to them as well, even though they're not in the same place every time. And so space really comes down to geometry. We talked about information and knowing where your satellite is. So you have to have your ground command that can point to your satellite and get that information. You have to be able to disseminate that out to any sort of moving element that's on the ground. And then we've also got even a naval domain. So that's always moving. Ships are not static. We've got submarines. We've also got air. So we have capability to talk to airplanes as well. And so making sure you know where each little piece is in this whole big web is incredibly complicated. and you're calling it, it really comes down to communications. If that part fails, then, like I said, it doesn't matter what sort of information you have if you can't get that into the hands of decision makers to use it.
Right, right. And of course, cyber is a fifth domain that kind of cuts across all of them as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that the space domain is, let's see here, I have a defined by the Space Force as the altitude where atmospheric effects on airborne objects becomes negligible. And so this space domain, Britany, is a place where you've talked about, you started touching on it a little bit with the different orbits. So what is the space domain in terms of orbits? Where can we put our satellites? How do we get them up there? Or sorry, how do we place them, and where do we place them and why?
Sure, that's actually a complicated question. You might not think so. So most folks tend to deal with Earth orbit. So that's the region, like you described, from basically as soon as atmospheric effects stop taking place, all the way up to a little bit higher than geosynchronous orbit. So we also have something called a graveyard orbit, which is typically above geo. And so anything between those really spectrums is what we consider Earth orbit. And that's where we do most of our Earth monitoring. So the other thing we didn't really talk about is why we go to space in the first place, right? And really it's to collect information. So there's one side, which is collecting information about space, so more of our scientific research, and then we also have Earth observation. And either way, you're still collecting information. So different orbits give you different types of information. If we're looking down towards Earth, typically, our low Earth orbit, LEO, is helpful because you're closer to the Earth. That goes up to about 1,000 kilometers altitude above the surface of the Earth. So the benefit of that is you get great resolution, like for cameras, different instruments, you're just closer, you're able to see more. It's easier to talk to your satellite in some ways, you don't have to go as far. The problem is you're moving very quickly. I think we have a previous episode that talks a bit about how fast satellites move through space. But you only get to talk to your satellite for maybe say 10 to 20 minutes in low Earth orbit on average. That's pretty fast. So if you need to do something that requires a bit more contact time, you might move up into medium Earth orbit, MEO, MEO. That's where we put some of our communication satellites, a little bit of navigation, less observation, but really you can observe from anywhere depending on what you're trying to get information on, right? And then finally we have our geo orbit, which lots of folks are familiar with. That's the orbit where you actually appear to hover, let's say, above a certain point on the Earth. And so that's where our slots come into play. If you want to be above a specific part on the Earth, you have to be truly in space above that point on the Earth. And you can only fit so many satellites in a certain bit of orbit. So up there, that's where we put anything that needs some, we call persistence. So you're always visible, always in contact, can always observe what you're trying to observe. There's other more interesting orbits as well, but those are really the ones that folks tend to go into the most. They're the most beneficial.
Okay, thanks, Britany. So, Kristen, do you have anything to add in terms of where we place our satellites or what the space domain looks like?
So the orbits that Britany covered are the ones that are most useful for information about the Earth. There's a couple of others that are interesting because they are information about the domain that helps us fly those satellites that are in low Earth to geosynchronous orbit. Two that come to mind are the Lagrange points. And those are points where the sun, the Earth, and the moon's gravity balance each other out. And that allows us to put satellites, and when I say us, primarily scientific satellites, but they allow us to get warning when we've had solar flares, so we can see incoming basically charged particles that could potentially damage satellites. So space is not just contested because people operate satellites there. Space itself is also a harsh environment. And having that little bit of extra warning, and we're now talking about 7 to 10 minutes for some of the heavier particles, possibly as much as a few hours. But that would allow satellite operators who are, again, using that same communications link that we know is a limited resource to be able to safe their satellites and make sure that the satellites are able to operate through whatever the sun is throwing at us as well.
Oh, and I'm glad you mentioned the Lagrange points too, because yeah, those there's certain Lagrange points that are more coveted, correct? Than
There
others.
absolutely are. There's ones that are quite stable. The one that we use for early warning typically is the one that sits between the sun and the earth. If you back up God's eye view of the solar system, there's one between the sun and the earth. The other two that are useful are the two that sit just ahead and just behind the earth in the earth's orbit around the sun. And those give us unobstructed views into what the solar system's environment looks like, and that are not being impacted by the Earth's magnetic field, which is another area of the environment that the satellite operators need to make sure that their satellites are able to work through.
Right. Yeah. So people think of space as being empty, but there's really a lot of stuff up there to deal with. And yeah, those Lagrange points, you can just kind of hang out and hover without using a lot of energy. So that's where we're putting satellites, where we're putting things. What about actually getting up there? Britany, so one of the things that we had talked about before was launching. And why do we launch from certain places? It's just a simple question for us lay people.
Sure. There's a few things that go into where you launch and when. So the first one is, I think most folks tend to be familiar that we launch from the coast, usually California or Florida, at least us in the US, right? And a large part of that is actually safety. So we never want to launch a satellite over anywhere people live in case something bad happens. We always hope that every mission is perfect and goes up to orbit as planned. Something else that aerospace does is mission assurance, which looks into our launch vehicles, the rockets, to say, is this actually going to launch successfully, right? And as hard as we all try, sometimes things still go wrong. And so if something goes wrong, you don't want that to impact any human lives. So we always try to launch over water. That's the first step. The next part is you have to launch from a specific latitude in order to get up to where you're going in space. Otherwise, you consume a lot of fuel to adjust that orbit once you get up into space. And there's only so much we can do. Sometimes that's just what happens. We are limited on where we can launch. We can't launch from anywhere. There's no mobile launch pads yet.
So how does latitude, your latitude, affect how much fuel you use?
Sure. So the higher up on Earth, higher up in latitude you launch from is as low as you can go in orbit. So if you're trying to get to a true geosynchronous orbit, right, which would be above the equator, you can't do that from higher up in latitude. So Florida, is pretty low, pretty close to the equator. That's good. But either way, you have to adjust your orbit later if you want to move it down in inclination. You can think of inclination as if the equator is flat, right? Anything popped up all the way up to the poles is a change in inclination. And that is a very expensive maneuver in terms of fuel cost. Our satellites are only so big, so they get the biggest boost in fuel and energy, which is really what defines your orbit from that launch vehicle. So once they've separated from the launch vehicle, you're at the mercy of whatever fuel you carry on board. And it's usually very limited.
Right. Because of course, the heavier, the more fuel you have, the heavier everything is. And then the heavier everything is, it costs more fuel to get up there, right?
It's a complicated equation, absolutely. The other thing I'll add is also schedule. So even if we have an ideal place to launch from, we have more and more satellites launching every day. And oftentimes they don't always launch according to their ideal schedule. And so there also is congestion on the ground. We have to compete occasionally for a spot on the launch pad, a date to launch. And unfortunately, any sort of schedule delay also impacts our cost. The satellites don't launch themselves, and we have teams and teams of folks on the ground, support crews that both launch the satellite and start talking to it as soon as it gets to orbit. Aerospace does what we call launch COLA, launch collision avoidance. And we'll even calculate windows to say, there are a lot of things in space. The last thing we want to do is launch a satellite or a rocket up and hit things on the way. So we also have to deconflict even debris to make sure we launch in a window that's safe for our satellites so that they get up there in one piece.
Yeah. So Kristen, there's something about launching from the East Coast as opposed to West Coast too, right?
There is. The Earth is spinning. Everybody knows sun rises in the east, sets in the west. Well, we're taking advantage of that if we launch off of the East Coast. And so the launches from the East Coast that head to the east are getting a little extra boost from the fact that the Earth is rotating. So if you think of a pitcher and they're winding up, their arm just before they release the ball is what the Earth is giving as extra momentum to those satellites as they're getting tossed up on their launch vehicle.
Right. And so speaking of movements of satellites, why is it so important that we launch into certain orbits? Why can't we just move the satellites to the orbit we want to be in?
So as Britany already laid out on the relative fuel difference, launch vehicles carry way more fuel than what a typical satellite is able to bring with it. The other part is that satellites are going up because they've got a job to do. And the more time that you spend moving them, the less time they're going to spend doing their job. And so part of the art of launching is putting them into the right place so that they can get to do their job as quickly as possible for as long as possible with the minimum amount of resources expended. And that's what makes space cost effective. If you're moving satellites around all the time, they will definitely not be spending time in mission. And until recently, we've not had mission extender vehicles on orbit that could allow them to be serviced. And so whatever you took with you was what you had for the entire road trip. So there was no pulling over for a bag of chips or soda. You definitely had to make sure your cooler was packed and your launch vehicle was everything that you were going to bring.
So can you talk just a little bit more about the servicing?
Sure. Although
you mentioned the extender vehicles, right? So this is something relatively new in terms of the kind of logistics of space and what that might look like in the near future, I'll say.
Absolutely. The concept of it is not new. The space stations, having astronauts on orbit, being able to take astronauts from Earth up to the space station is essentially the same concept as any refueler or any mission extender vehicle. What we are now seeing is the ability to do so to launch, rendezvous in orbit. So you've got two satellites that need to connect to each other. They're traveling kilometers per second. Anybody who looks at the speedometer on their dash knows that that's quick. And once they get into relative space, so that they are now not only orbiting around the Earth, they are trying to make sure that specific parts of their vehicles are going to mate with the other specific part on the other vehicle so that you can exchange whatever resources you brought up, whether it's people, fuel, food, etc. We've gotten reasonably good with that through NASA in low Earth orbit. The new thing, the exciting thing that we're seeing is a commercial capability in geosynchronous orbit. And so the satellites whose payloads may still be working, but their power supplies or their fuel may not. And so with the advent of commercial capabilities that can be launched into geosynchronous orbit, mate with a satellite whose mission is still good, but the vehicle itself is not able to sustain that mission. It's basically adding on an extra gas can or adding on a second driver on your road trip. And once you've added them on, you can now extend your mission several years. The payback in terms of the monetary investment is obviously huge because you don't have to build an entire new vehicle. And you have the added advantage of end-of-life considerations. Right now, countries are supposed to clean up after themselves. If you're sitting in a highly coveted spot, once your mission is done, you have to reserve enough fuel and enough control of your vehicle to get it out of the way so that the next person who's coming in can have a clean, good-to-go spot. The mission extender vehicles give you a new option to do that. And it's kind of exciting because it not only breathes life into older vehicles, it opens up some new paradigms on how we think about launches. We could send up vehicles that are far more mission capable if we're sending up fuel separately on a perhaps cheaper or buying in bulk, I guess, more cost-effective way of getting fuel or getting the satellites moved into new spots.
Yeah, no, that's great. That is really exciting in terms of the future. And it's not just you mentioned all of it really, but saving on build and launch costs and being able to rebuild the classic car in your driveway and actually use it. So in terms of making satellites useful. So, Britany, what other ways do we make satellites useful? What are we? You kind of touched on it at the very beginning, but what are we looking at up there? There's the idea of the kind of space domain awareness, a little bit of what Kristen had started to mention, but also Earth observation and other observations. What kind of sensors do we put on satellites?
Sure. I mean, really, the possibilities are endless. I think a lot of us default to thinking about pictures, right? Because it's something that it's really easy to understand. We can access some of those images and get to see, the biggest thing is Google Maps, right? A lot of us use Google Maps, which is you can pull up that satellite filter and see what it looks like from a bird's eye view.
Well, even the things that we've been seeing coming out of Ukraine with the Russian invasion and the buildup and during, people are like, oh, we can actually see the tanks lining up.
So something interesting about that, right, is we have now a lot of automation that can tell us change detection. So if we're always taking pictures at the same spot every day is usually how some of those satellites are up in what we call a sun synchronous orbit. So they're revisiting the same part of Earth at the same time of day, which is important because the lighting is the same, ideally. Weather can have some impacts there, but if you're always looking at the same time of day and you have a consistent image, we can then process those images automatically or automated in an automated fashion, so we can see if anything has changed. And so what that tells us is, like you mentioned, Colleen, is, okay, well, there were not troops there before, but now today there are. And so that can give us some warnings to say, something's going on, that this is moving in a way that we don't expect. There was no any sort of announcement about this. We don't know what's going on. And so it gives us that information to say, we need to start taking a closer look. And so we talked a little bit about moving satellites. We can also position sensors in different ways. So just because your satellite is in one place, there's also the concept of attitude, or what we also call pose, which is a combination of position and attitude.
So it's not like this. It's not like this kind of.
It kind of is.
Yeah.
So right now, I'm in one position, but if I turn my head here, I haven't moved, but my literal pose, my attitude has changed. Right. And so that's important if we're looking down, but it's also important if we're looking up. So our sensors on the Earth are also looking up at our satellites to say, where is my satellite? If I need to command it to point or to look in a different direction, you have to know where it is first so you can send your communication link the right way. So a lot of what we do in space all comes down to perception. Whether it's looking down or looking up, we rarely have perfect information of where something is. And so the better our sensors are, the more accurate information we can get. And that's incredibly helpful for us understanding where something is and what it is. If we have a bad image quality, we might see that there's something has changed on the ground. We might not know if it's a school bus or a tank, right? And that's hugely important.
Right. Kristen, anything to add to that?
The problem that Britany just walked us through was Earth observation, so looking down. When you've got sensors on the ground looking up, and I'm thinking in particular telescopes and radars, they have the same problems. And so if you think about a piece of paper, if it's flat side towards you, it looks far bigger than if it's on an edge. Well, satellites can do the same thing. And so you get larger radar returns if you've got a satellite that's broadside to you versus one that's trying to be skinny. And the sun makes a huge difference for observation. And so when telescopes are looking for satellites, how much of the satellite is shiny and how much of that shiny part is angled such that it catches the sun and reflects the sun back towards the sensor that's sitting on the ground. Both of those factors, whether it's radar phenomenology or optical phenomenology, make a huge difference on how well we can survey the space environment and therefore know where satellites are and what they are doing when they're there.
And so why is that important? I mean, we've been talking a little bit, we've been talking entirely about kind of contested space, but I also wanted to at least touch on the idea of crowded space. So you're talking about looking up, and then before talking about looking around while we're up there. So, space is crowded, even though we think it's big. We're running into each other. There's things up there. There's lots of satellites up there, of course. And there's also a lot of debris that is not useful, not being used. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Depending on the orbit and its usefulness. So sun-synchronous orbits in low Earth orbit are the ones that take those pictures over time. As we get out to a medium Earth orbit, 22,000 kilometers or so, we're talking about primarily position and navigation signals. That's where the GPS constellation sits. And then as we move out towards geosynchronous orbit, we have all of our long duration Earth steering missions. So missile warning, communications providers all sit up there, as do a number of intelligence collectors. And they use the advantage of staring at it for a long time at a single spot. As satellites have gotten smaller, as they have gotten more fidelity in the commanding and the ability to support multiple missions, you will see groups of satellites. And so there's a couple of clusters in geosynchronous orbit that I'm thinking of in particular, where you could have within a single geosynchronous longitude. So in space, you're talking about 4 or 5 satellites that are occupying a space that's only a couple of 100 kilometers across. That's important. Most of us think a couple 100 kilometers, that's the state of Colorado. Why are you worried? Well, I'm worried for a couple of reasons. All of those vehicles don't necessarily know where each other is. And we can talk about satellites that do know where each other are next. But for those that don't know where each other are, they're going to rely on observations from the ground to help them do relative navigation to each other. When you've got a mission that requires relative navigation, and I'm thinking now of like synthetic aperture radar, where you have to have satellites that are very specifically positioned relative to each other so that the radar signals bounce off the Earth and are collected by their partner.
So you're talking about a type of sensor that we put on the satellites, the aperture.
Yes, synthetic aperture radar.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that is SAR. Sorry, that was in my head.
SAR. So those are more low Earth orbit.
Right.
Then you've got ones that are sitting in geo, and they're providing a mission, in this case, like COM, where you've got multiple vehicles that are all occupying a single longitudinal spot.
So they have to move in unison.
They do.
Yeah.
In both cases, they have to move in unison, and they have to know where each other are. But if they don't have onboard sensing, they can't tell for themselves. So it's like driving in a car with the windows blacked out. You need someone else to tell you who's next to you. You get the little blinky light if you've got lane assist. Is somebody next to you? Nope, then I can scoot over. Yep, right. Someone's next to me. So the impact of the sensors and what they are able to see then drives the accuracy that the satellite operators are able to use to do relative navigation if they don't have any sensors on board themselves.
Yeah, so that looking up really is important when it comes to these formations of satellites.
It absolutely is.
Yeah. Britany, anything to add in terms of space traffic management, coordination? I know that we had talked about some things.
We did. There's a couple other reasons I guess we care about why we know what is going on in space. One, from the ground perspective, is a little bit like what Kristen alluded to, is if we need to move relative to another satellite, we don't always know very well what our position is from space. We also don't always know what's going on with a satellite controlled by someone else. So, we might be looking at our satellite and say, everything's great. And then there's something that we call a collision avoidance warning system, really. So there's an organization that tells each satellite operator, what the probability of collision is for each day with every other object in space. And if that probability gets too high, and then what we call miss distance, the distance between those two objects gets too high, someone needs to move. And that's another point of contested space is, well, we don't really have any space police, right? And so who's going to force one of those satellites to move? What happens if one of those pieces is debris and the other satellite doesn't have enough fuel to move? And so from the ground, we have to watch all of that to make sure we know what the configuration of all those objects are to say, is this high enough risk that we need to intervene? The other aspect of this that is related is anomaly detection. So if we're expecting satellites to move in a certain way, and then all of a sudden we see from the ground that it didn't move like we expected or is somewhere different, Usually we want to go figure out why. Because again, we can't talk to the satellites that belong to other countries, or if they're dead satellites that are completely inoperable. We have to watch from the ground. And it's the only way we can figure out if something's going on that we didn't expect and how to manage that.
I want to thank you. So we're toward the end. Are there any like last comments that you'd like to make sure that our audience kind of understands? Well, I mean, I would love to hear a little bit about maybe the Space Warfighting Center in Colorado Springs. Can you just share with our audience quickly about what the purpose of that is? And it's an aerospace facility that's just opened up quite recently, right? Kristen?
Yeah. So,
Britany, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so both Kristen and I are in Colorado Springs. We have a brand new building called the Space Warfighting Center, and really it's a combination of both our program offices and engineering groups that can work together to solve these hard problems for different customers and mission areas.
Kristen?
I'll add on to what Britany just laid out. Excuse me. The Space Warfighting Center, because it's got physics models that underpin the analysis that goes on, it's a huge step up from the tabletop exercises that the military had been doing. And it allows us to put some realism into the military's conceptual thinking about how they would operate and fight in contested space, as well as being able to practice how that fight would actually go down. And so all of the data latencies, how long does it take for information to come through? How long does processing have to take, and how can we speed it up? All of those things we are now able to far more realistically model and expose our military partners to, so that their mindset going in correctly accounts for all of the variables that they have to deal with in contested space.
I love that. And I know you guys are doing very important things with the Warfighting Center. So I do appreciate you taking the time to kind of come and break things down a little bit, basically into, how space works, right? We know that it's not like Star Wars, but just how much is it not like Star Wars? So thank you very much to both Britany and Kristen for joining us today. And of course, you can check out all of the research and other events that CSPS puts on at csps.aerospace.org. Browse all of the space policy shows on YouTube or your favorite podcast. And I want to say thank you to James Liggins and Max Siegel, our technical production team. Everyone, until next time, thanks.